The train came through at the hour where morning still wore its nightgown. Steam hissed like breath, held too long curling around the iron wheels as if reluctant to leave. The platform was mostly empty, just a half-dozing station boy, two farmers with soil still on their boots, and a sheriff leaning against a hitching post like time had no say over him. Then she stepped down. Her skirt was wrinkled at the hem, one side damp with milk. A bonnet shielded her face, but not the curve of her jaw, not the way her shoulders sagged like someone had hung their sorrow there for years. She carried a baby wrapped in a fraying blue quilt against her chest. Another clung to her coat with tiny hands dragging one leather boot behind him, like it had seen too many winters for a child that small. She did not look up, not at the men watching, not at the dust curling like a ghost around her ankles, not even at the man who stepped forward from the edge of the platform, lifting his hat with a smirk and eyes that didn't know how to hold anything steady. "Didn't say nothing about twins," the man muttered. He was younger than expected, with soft hands and a hard tongue. "You ain't the picture you sent." She said nothing, just shifted the baby in her arms. "I can't take this on," he said, gesturing vaguely at the children like they were stray dogs. "I needed someone quiet, not a whole mess of problems." She blinked slowly. Her eyes weren't angry, just tired, worn the way old books are worn, where every page has been turned with too much force. "You placed the ad," she whispered, voice raw like paper sliding across skin. "You said you'd be waiting." "I changed my mind." With that, he turned. The station boy looked down at his feet. One of the farmers cleared his throat. No one spoke. The woman adjusted the baby's bonnet, kissed the top of the child's head, then took the boy's hand and stepped down onto the dusty road. Her boots left two soft prints and one dragging trail. The sheriff watched from across the street, leaning on one-leg hat tilted low. He didn't move. Not yet. The boarding house sat near the edge of town, where the wind carried less gossip but more dust. She knocked only once before a woman with graying braids opened the door and said, "You'll need a week's rent in advance." "I can sew. Can you pay?" She reached into her pocket and unwrapped a small cloth bundle, 3 coins a thimble, and a silver button. The older woman took it without complaint and showed her a room at the top of the stairs. It was small, warm, and smelled of mothballs and forgotten soup. That night the twins cried together, then apart like a song, sung in painful echoes. The mother didn't complain. She fed them with patience and silence, rocking one with her foot while cradling the other in her arms. She hummed something low and broken, a tune from before life grew heavy. In the hallway, the boarding house keeper muttered to herself, "Ought to send her back. This town's no place for a woman like that." But the sheriff had heard it all from the porch outside. He stood in shadow, spine against the wall, listening to the woman inside speak to her children in that soft, honey-thick voice meant only for survival. "Hush now. Mama's got you. Just need a little time." He didn't knock. Just walked back down the stairs, the weight of her voice settling somewhere behind his ribs. The next morning she rose before the rooster did, tied her hair back with a faded ribbon. The twins were wrapped to her chest and hip as she walked into town. The general store was bright and clean, but its silence was louder than any storm. Women behind the counter paused mid-sentence when she entered. One child dropped a tin whistle and scurried behind his father's legs. She asked for a can of milk powder and cloth for sewing. The shopkeeper said, "Money first." She opened her palm, 3 buttons, a coin, and the offer of labor. The shopkeeper looked to his wife, who frowned, then waved her away. On the way out, her son tripped on the stairs and scraped his knee. Blood bloomed fast and angry. Before she could kneel, someone was already lifting the boy, wiping the wound with a clean white cloth pulled from his pocket. A silent man with a silver star pinned just above his heart. The sheriff. He said nothing, didn't look at her, just handed the boy back and walked off like nothing had happened. That night, a small package appeared at her door. Powdered milk, a thread spool, and 2 pairs of children's gloves, hand-sewn. No name, no note. But she looked out the window and saw him walking away, hat pulled, low boots, slow in the dirt. A week passed. She offered to sew curtains for the schoolhouse, fix the preacher's torn coat for a half a loaf of bread. She stitched clothes until her fingers bled, then wrapped them and kept going. The twins grew quieter, watched the world from their crib, with wide, dark eyes that missed nothing. Still no one said much. No invitations. No warm bread on the windowsill. Only quiet stares and judgment dressed as concern. One Sunday during service, she arrived at the back of the chapel, sat near the stove with her babies bundled against her. The preacher paused mid-sermon. People whispered. One woman moved her daughter closer away from the stranger. The sheriff sat up front alone as always. He turned just once, met her gaze. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. That evening, he found himself carving a piece of wood into the shape of a cradle. He didn't know why, only that his hands needed something to do, and her silence had followed him home like a ghost he didn't mind keeping company. A cold wind blew in that week. One night as he rode back from a distant ranch, he saw her walking on the edge of town. The baby strapped to her front was wrapped tight, but the other was in her arms crying softly. The wind tugged her shawl and her lips were blue. He dismounted without a word, lifted the older child, and walked beside her to the boarding house. She didn't thank him, but when they reached the steps, she paused. "I never asked your name." "Samuel." "Mine," she hesitated. "Well, just call me whatever you like. Folk don't usually stick around long enough to remember it." He tipped his hat and left. That night he didn't sleep, kept picturing those babies, how one had pressed a little hand to his coat, how she never once asked for help, but kept giving what little warmth she had. He returned to the edge of town the next morning, dropped off a pot of stew, then walked away before she opened the door. Later that week, when the boy at the livery kicked a can and nearly hit the babies, the sheriff was there within moments, didn't yell, just stared until the boy muttered an apology and scurried away. No one had ever stood up for her before, not once. That evening, she stepped out onto the porch as he passed. "You keep watching. I notice things. You don't say much. Don't need to." A long silence. "Then you remind me of someone I used to believe in." He didn't ask who didn't need to. Instead, he nodded and walked on, but slower than usual. At the end of the week, she sat by the stove, babies curled beside her, and whispered into the quiet. "They say the West don't care for weakness, but maybe it's not weakness to still hope." Outside, the wind answered softly, and from somewhere just beyond the window, a man stood still listening, waiting but not for too long. Snow fell that week like time, forgetting how to move forward. Soft, stubborn flakes drifted through the wooden slats of the town's awnings, muffling sound, silencing footsteps, blanketing even the gossip that normally blew down Main Street like tumbleweed. The widowed Sheriff Samuel kept to his rhythm, silent patrols at dawn and dusk coffee scalding, and black at the same corner of a saloon hat never taken off indoors. He walked like a man stitched to his grief carefully, so none of it spilled over. She watched him sometimes through the window of the boarding house. The curtain barely shifted just enough to see his silhouette blur past in the snow. He didn't look up, neither did she, but that didn't mean they weren't listening for each other. She had no last name that anyone remembered. The mail-order ledger called her Annie L., but no one asked what the L meant. Some folks muttered lost, others guessed left, but no one said it loud enough for her to answer. The boarding house woman kept to herself now, more polite than warm. She let Annie sew by the window if she cleaned after meals, let her boil baby linen in the kitchen if she scrubbed the copper pans afterward. It wasn't kindness, not really. It was just the way people survived one favor held up against another. By the second snowfall, Annie had started walking the streets at odd hours, not with purpose, but with quiet, the twins bundled in a shared shawl, cheeks pink, breathing little clouds. She'd paused near the schoolhouse then, again by the church, as if mapping a life she hadn't been allowed to live before. And always the Lawman noticed. He never followed her. He just adjusted his patrol to intersect. Once at the mercantile, he held the door without a word. She stepped through, brushing past him like wind. Her shoulder touched his chest for less than a second. She didn't apologize, neither did he. But that night she lit a second candle on her windowsill, and he saw it from across the street. By the third week, whispers had turned to warnings. "She's up to something," the baker's wife told anyone who'd listen. "Don't trust a woman who walks so quiet." "She ain't right," the young deputy muttered to Samuel. "Some of them city girls hide things. Desperate women do strange things." Samuel didn't answer, just cleaned his rifle and stared out the frosted pane at the schoolyard where Annie stood with one child on her hip, watching the wind move through the swings. He remembered when his own wife had stood in that spot, years ago, belly full with a child that never saw spring. He remembered the way grief twisted a woman's mouth, but Annie's mouth wasn't twisted. It was tired, yes. but not bitter. Not yet. And maybe that was what made him ache more than anything. One late afternoon, as snow turned to sleet, Annie came into the sheriff's office. She didn't knock, just stepped inside, cradling one child while the other slept in a woven basket at her feet. "I need a letter written," she said. Samuel looked up slowly. A letter. To someone back east. A brother, I suppose. Or what's left of one. He didn't ask why. Didn't ask what for. Just pulled out a pen and paper and waited. She stood across from him like she was holding a storm behind her eyes. "Dear Andrew," she said, each word careful, scraped clean of feeling. "I made it. The man I came for turned me away. I stayed anyway. I ain't asking for help. I just need you to know I'm still alive. And I forgave you the minute I left." She paused, then added softer. "You were only ever doing what Pa told you to, just like I was." Samuel wrote it down, folded it, sealed it with wax. "Thank you," she said, but the words were more breath than sound. She turned to leave, then hesitated. "You ever lose someone?" she asked, not looking at him. He nodded. "My wife and son." "When?" 3 winters passed. She swallowed something hard, then said, "I'm sorry," and left. That night the candle in her window burned a little longer. So did the one in his. But still, no one dared step into the other's shadow. Not yet. By January's end, tragedy arrived with no knock or warning. The youngest twin, the girl, fell sick, feverish lips pale, breath shallow. The boarding house matron wrung her hands but offered no medicine. The town doctor was 2 towns over, caught in a snowdrift. Annie wrapped the child in every warm thing. She had held her close for hours, singing until her voice cracked like thin ice. Samuel heard about it before breakfast. By noon he was at the door. "You need firewood?" he asked. She didn't answer. He placed a stack on the porch anyway. "You need milk?" She blinked once. He handed her a tin and turned to leave, but she called after him. "She won't last a night." He paused, then walked back inside, didn't say a word, just built the fire. Boiled water and sat beside them. All through that night he stayed. When the fever broke at dawn and the child finally slept without whimpering, Annie laid her hand against the sheriff's arm. "Why'd you stay?" His voice was quiet because he didn't ask me to. The silence between them was no longer hollow. It was full of things unsaid, things understood, things held. From that night forward, Samuel's route always passed the boarding house. Not for duty, for comfort. One morning the twins took their first steps. The boy wobbled toward a pair of boots near the door as Samuel's boots. He laughed, a soft, hoarse sound, like a man remembering how. Annie looked up and smiled, not with her mouth, with her whole face. The next Sunday the preacher hesitated before the sermon, scanning the pews. When Annie entered with her babies, no one moved away. Not this time. She sat 2 rows from the front alone until Samuel joined her. Later that week she brought him a hand-stitched scarf. He didn't open it right away. When he did, he found the word "peace" embroidered in the corner. No signature. He wore it every day after. But peace has a way of making some men restless. The man who'd once rejected her, the first one, returned. He rode in on a borrowed horse-clothes, fine-faced smug. The town tensed. He asked where she was staying. No one answered. He asked again. When Samuel heard, he didn't saddle his horse. He walked slowly, snow crunching under each step. He found the man by the saloon. "What do you want?" Samuel asked. "She's mine. She ain't a thing to claim. I placed the ad. She's my property." Samuel stared long and level. "She's got a home now. She ain't married. Not yet." That silenced him, but not for long. "Think you'll fix her?" the man sneered. "She's broken, Sheriff." "No," Samuel said, voice low. "She's healing." That night, Annie stood at the window again, watching the dark. A knock at her door. She opened it to find note. One line written in a quiet hand. "If you ever want more than peace, I'll be waiting." She folded it slowly, pressed it to her chest, and left the light in the window burning. Just a little longer this time. The proposal didn't come with flowers or promises. It came on a gray morning, thick with wind and silence. Samuel stood on the boarding house steps, hat in hand, looking like a man about to face judgment. Annie opened the door slowly. The twins bundled behind her like anchors wrapped in quilts. "I ain't come to make you mine," he said, only to ask if maybe we could share what's left. Her eyes narrowed, not suspicious, just wary. "What do you mean? I've got a house, a stove that stays warm, a barn that don't leak." You've got two children who need quiet and a woman's strength I've never seen in all my years. He paused. I can offer steady, not romance, not yet. She didn't answer right away. The silence between them bloomed wide, stretching out like the flat plains beyond town, full of stillness and buried things. I don't want to be beholden, she said at last. You won't be, he said, just welcome. That word hung in the air, welcome like something she'd never truly had. Later that day, she packed the baby's things with hands that didn't tremble, but moved like they were stitching her own heart back together. She said goodbye to the boarding house without a single tear. The matron offered a nod more respect than warmth and closed the door behind her. Samuel helped load her things onto the wagon. 2 bags, 1 small trunk, a sewing kit, a folded quilt with a name embroidered into the corner, half picked apart. Lucille, he read aloud, my mother's. She said the only softness I ever knew. He didn't ask more. They rode in silence, the babies nestled between them, sleeping against the rhythm of the wagon wheels. His cabin sat at the edge of the valley, where cottonwoods leaned like old men, and the wind carried less noise and more memory. It was small. One main room, a stone hearth shelves lined with old books and things untouched since his wife passed, a hand mirror, a chipped teacup, a small wooden cradle covered in a cloth. She noticed it but said nothing. Inside, he cleared the far corner of the room, set up the second crib with the care of a man patching a broken fence. Not rushed, not graceful, just honest. That night, the fire burned slow. The babies slept in their new cribs, one sucking on a thumb, the other murmuring in dreams. She sat near the window, fingers curled around a mug of warm milk. He poured himself a coffee and sat across the room. No words, but something changed in the quiet between them, a shift subtle as the snow melting at the window's edge. In the morning, she lit the stove before he woke, cooked a pan of cornmeal cakes, and laid out his shirt beside a basin of warm water. He dressed in silence but left a slice of dried apple beside her sewing basket before heading out to his rounds. It became a rhythm. He rose early. She warmed the house. He returned at noon. She served soup. Evenings were quieter. He'd sit and whittle wood by the hearth. She'd mend old clothes or hum lullabies to the children. Sometimes their hands would brush when reaching for the same cup. They never flinched, just looked away. Days passed, then weeks. Spring began to nudge its way through the frost. The twins laughed more. One took her first step. The other learned to say B.A. when reaching for bread. One afternoon, Samuel found her weeping, not loud, not dramatic, just a soft sound like a stream trying not to overflow. He stepped back, unsure. She wiped her face and shook her head. Don't mind me. It's just I didn't think peace would feel so strange. He didn't ask why didn't need to. He sat beside her, let her cry, and when she leaned against his shoulder just for a moment, he let her stay. That night he set a fresh log on the fire and whispered, "You ain't strange for feeling safe like it might disappear." She didn't respond, but her fingers slipped beneath his and stayed there until the fire died down to embers. Trouble returned in the form of a letter delivered by a writer addressed to Annie in rough script. She read it by lantern light, face pale and drawn, folded it 3 times before sliding it into the back of the sewing drawer. He waited. She said nothing. That night she stood on the porch long after he'd gone to bed. The stars blinked down like eyes that knew secrets but wouldn't speak. When he asked the next morning, she shook her head. Just ghosts, she said. Still something had shifted again. She grew quiet, flinched at loud sounds, walked faster when passing certain parts of town. The baby sensed it, grew clingier, craved her touch. Samuel watched, waited. Finally, one evening after supper, she spoke. He's coming. He didn't need to ask who. He says he changed, that he was drunk that day, that he wants to see them. She didn't look at Samuel, just kept her eyes on the flames. I don't want him near them, but I don't know if I have a say. Samuel stood slowly. You do. What if he makes trouble? He won't. What if he lies to the law? He paused. I am the law. The silence that followed was thick, tangled with years of distrust, old wounds, and the fragile hope of something new. She whispered, "You really believe I deserve to feel safe?" He met her gaze. "I believe you've earned it." And with that, something settled between them. Not a promise, not yet, but the root of one planted deep. The man came 3 days later, rode in with a smile too, slick eyes too narrow, dressed better than he had before, wore confidence like perfume, strong but cheap. Samuel met him outside the house. She don't want to see you. I'm her husband. You gave that up, not legally. Samuel didn't flinch. She's under my roof now. She's got my children. Samuel took a slow breath. They ain't things and you're no father. A pause, then a smile. We'll see about that. The man rode off, but not far. He lingered in town, drank, talked, dropped stories like seeds, some true, most twisted. By week's end, half the town was buzzing. She stole his children. She tricked the sheriff. She's not who she says she is. And he stopped going to town. Samuel went twice as often. One night he returned with bruised knuckles and a tear in his coat. She didn't ask. He didn't explain. They sat beside the fire, neither speaking. The twins played between them, stacking blocks. When one toppled over and the baby whimpered, Samuel reached down and set it back up. She watched, then said softly, "They trust you." He looked up. "So do I." That night as snow fell again in soft, tired flurries, Annie pulled out the cradle her daughter had outgrown and placed it near the fire. Then she laid a folded quilt inside. He noticed his voice quiet. "What's that for?" She shrugged. "Maybe nothing." A pause. Maybe hope. And for the first time she leaned in, not by accident, not by need, but with intent. Her lips touched his cheek barely, but it burned like sunlight. He didn't move, didn't speak, just closed his eyes. And when she whispered, "Maybe we build slow, but maybe we build strong," he finally answered. "Strong lasts longer anyway." The fire crackled. The twins slept. And outside the wind turned, carrying with it the scent of something coming, something not quite settled, not yet. The wind changed before the trouble came. It swept down from the north, cutting clean through fence posts and chimney smoke, curling cold beneath doors as if whispering a warning in a language no one had spoken aloud in years. Samuel felt it first in his bones, in the ache behind his shoulder, from an old wound that only flared when things were about to go wrong. He didn't mention it to Annie, but he oiled his rifle that night, checked the hinges on the front door, and sat longer by the fire before extinguishing the lamp. She felt it too, though she said nothing, only that she wanted the twins to sleep closer to her, that she'd light the cradle by the bed again, just for a little while. They didn't name their fear. Naming things made them real. The man came back the next day, this time not alone. He rode in with two others, lean, hungry types with nervous eyes and fingers that hovered too close to their gun belts. They didn't ride into town. They rode straight toward the cabin. Samuel saw them from the ridge above, where he'd been repairing the north fence. He didn't race back. He walked steady, deliberate. Fear had no place in his stride, only resolve. When he reached the house, Annie was already standing on the porch, one baby on her hip, the other behind her legs, gripping her dress. The man sat atop his horse like a king, surveying land he'd never earned. "You've had your fun," he called out. "Time to give back what's mine." "They're not yours," she said. Her voice didn't tremble. "They never were. You're not married to this man Law says." Samuel stepped into view, rifle across his chest. "Law says I'm the one who decides what happens in this town, and I say you've said enough." One of the others dismounted. "Easy now," he said, hands out. "We just want to talk." Samuel didn't move. "Then you picked the wrong house." The wind picked up. The man on horseback laughed. "You think she loves you? You're just a quiet fool with a badge." Samuel didn't rise to it. "Just said you should ride on while the road's still open." But the man's pride was louder than sense. He spat. "You think you can stop me from seeing my blood? She's not your wife," Samuel said. "And those children, they've never called you father." He stepped down from the porch, walked forward until he stood level with the man's horse. "This is your last warning." The rider dismounted. "You can't shoot me for showing up," he said, smirking. "No," Samuel agreed. "But I can arrest you for trespassing." A pause. The man reached for something beneath his coat. Quick, reckless. But Samuel was quicker. The rifle fired once. A clean shot, not to kill, just to stop. The bullet struck the ground near the man's feet, kicking up earth in warning. The horses reared. One of the men fled, stumbling over himself. The other raised his hands high. The man who'd brought them here stood still, face pale. "You done?" Samuel asked. The man nodded once. "They ain't worth dying for." Samuel's voice was calm. "They're worth everything. The man turned, got on his horse, didn't look back. Neither did the others. When the dust cleared, Annie stepped down slowly, the child still in her arms. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "I did," he said. "I'm sorry he came." "I'm not." She looked up. "I was afraid you'd think I brought trouble." He stepped closer. "You brought life." And then for the first time they kissed, not sudden, not stolen, but earned. Soft and slow like spring after a long winter. That night the cabin was quieter than usual, not with fear, with peace. The twins slept soundly, one curled in Samuel's old cradle, the other in Annie's arms. He sat at the edge of the bed watching them breathe. She said, "It feels like we've built something no one can take." He nodded. "That's because we built it slow." Later they spoke in low voices beneath the quilts about the past, the places they'd been, the people they'd lost. She told him about her mother, the only soul who'd ever brushed her hair just to feel close. He told her about his boy, how he'd carved a tiny horse for him, one that never got played with. She touched his hand. "You can give it to mine." He smiled, real and full. "Yours or mine?" The next morning Samuel rode into town, not to talk, to file a marriage license. The clerk raised an eyebrow. "You finally settling down?" Samuel just nodded. Later that day a small ceremony took place on the cabin porch. Just the preacher, the deputy, and the wind as witness. No fancy dress, no grand promises, just two hands held, two names spoken aloud, and the sound of two children laughing somewhere behind them. She wore a yellow ribbon in her hair. He wore his badge over his heart, not as a symbol of authority, but of belonging. When the preacher said, "You may now," they didn't kiss right away. They just leaned their foreheads together and breathed. That evening she unpacked the last of her things, hung a picture on the wall, her mother young and smiling, standing in a field of wild wheat. He added his carving, the little wooden horse, to the mantel, two pieces of different stories sharing the same shelf. At dinner the twins reached for the bread at the same time. Their hands touched, then clapped together. Samuel looked up. "They're growing fast." "They feel safe," she said. "They are." That night a storm rolled in. Thunder cracked above the cabin, lightning painting silver veins through the dark sky. The twins cried out, startled. Samuel and Annie rushed to them, each scooping one child into their arms. Together they sang off key, off rhythm, but with so much love that even the storm grew quiet listening. Afterward the four of them curled up together on the floor, wrapped in quilts, hearts beating in steady rhythm. 3 heartbeats once haunted that house. Now there were 4, and none of them felt alone. Later, when the fire burned low and the babies had drifted into dreams, Annie whispered, "Do you think people can really start over?" Samuel kissed the crown of her head. "No, I think people carry everything with them. But sometimes someone helps carry it different." She closed her eyes. "Then I'm glad it was you." They fell asleep in each other's arms, and outside the storm passed, not with fury, but with release. The prairie held its breath, then let it go. The next morning the sun broke through the clouds, a golden kind of light that warmed the porch, the windows, the tops of the cribs. Annie stood holding a cup of tea, watching the land stretch toward forever. Samuel stepped beside her, one hand on her back. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Behind them the children stirred. The day waited to be lived, and so did the life they'd built. Sometimes love doesn't roar in like thunder. Sometimes it arrives as shelter. And if you've ever known the cold, truly known it, then you'll understand the miracle of warmth when it finally stays. So here's to the ones who choose the quiet house, the ones who show up when no one else does, the ones who carry others, not because they're weak, but because they remember how heavy life once was. Because that kind of love, slow, steady, and sacred, can survive any storm. And it always leaves the light on. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.